Susan, thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you.
It's a pleasure, Sabrina. We certainly have enough to talk about.
We have no shortage of things to talk about, especially at a time like this. So we're just going to dive right in. But before we get to more recent events, it's been an incredibly busy few years for the ACLU. If you can just kind of talk about the backdrop kind of coming into the moment we're in now.
Well, I think the backdrop is for 100 years, we've been working on important civil liberties problems that focused on both the federal government and all of the states. We have affiliates in all 50 states. And for the past 3.5 years, especially, the staff had already been working overtime, bringing 173 legal actions against Trump administration policies like squelching immigration and family separations and banning transgender people in the military. So our staff was already hard pressed and working really hard, not only with respect to federal policies, but in all of the states about anti-immigrant laws, challenges to reproductive freedom, voting rights, mass incarceration. So, there's the backdrop.
And you were already working on all of those issues before the pandemic hit. Obviously, we're having this conversation from our respective homes. The last couple months, 3 months now, you've had people across the country and around the world who've really, been living through the consequences of this pandemic. How has it affected the work that the ACLU is doing?
Well, I would say, Sabrina, in two different ways. First of all, when COVID hit, the staff had to deal with whole new buckets of virus-related work, in addition to, as you're saying, working remotely from home, sometimes while juggling a toddler and a cat. I think the first example that I would give you of virus-related work, just because it's been the most demanding in many ways, is trying to save the lives of medically vulnerable people in prisons and jails and immigration detention facilities. So since March, the ACLU has brought over 100 legal actions and done a lot of lobbying in virtually every state to try to get them to protect people in prisons and jails and to release those who are particularly medically vulnerable and who there's no real reason not to release.
How has that played out at prisons across the country? What are the side effects that you're seeing of the ways in which officials at the local, state, federal level have kind of treated that aspect of society during the course of this pandemic?
Well, one thing that I think is really surprising is that so many jurisdictions have not been more attentive to the spread of COVID in prison, because what happens in prison doesn't just stay in prison. The guards are also exposed, and then they spread the virus to their communities when they go home. So we know that over 40,000 people in prisons and jails and immigration facilities in this country have been infected, and hundreds have died. And if you think about it, if you are in an overcrowded detention facility, they're just tinder boxes. You don't have control over whether you can socially distance or how often you can wash your hands. You may not have access to hand sanitizers, etc. And so, I think this work has been especially heartbreaking in the context of immigration detention facilities, because we're talking about 36,000 people in this country who have been detained, whose only offense was wanting to be in the United States. And a lot of them are just living in death traps.
I want to talk about that a little bit more because, the conditions at immigration detention centers, that's been a source of longstanding concern. And some of that does even predate the Trump administration. This, of course, came up in 2014 during the migrant crisis under President Obama. But of course, in the aftermath of the Trump administration's family separation policy, there was a lot of focus around the kind of squalor that a lot of these children were actually being forced to live in. And I was curious, as you've now seen the effects of the pandemic, what has sort of been the concerns that have been top of mind? And can you talk a little bit about some of the cases that you've heard of, or the stories that you've heard of some of these people who are living or housed in these facilities?
Well, you're absolutely right, Sabrina, that even before COVID hit, that there were already many problems that we've been litigating and arguing with people about people in detention. You may recall the low moment when a government lawyer actually argued that there was no obligation on the part of the government to supply children with soap or toothpaste and necessities like that. So now I think these people are just doubly traumatized and terrified. And so far we've gotten over 400 vulnerable people released from ICE detention. And one of the problems here is that we've had to do a lot of litigation even just to find out what's going on, because ICE outsources a lot of this detention to private facilities. And so even just finding out how many people are ill and how many have died has been a terrible problem. But I can tell you there are people who are terrified. From the Otay Mesa facility outside San Diego, people have been calling anybody they can call every day to just express their desperation that they don't think it's fair that they're there in the first place. And now they're just doubly terrified.
Is there any sense of any of the precautions that are being taken in the midst of the pandemic at these detention centers? Are they just not? I mean, I know you talked a bit about a transparency problem because you don't even have
Right.
necessarily accurate numbers, but has there been any kind of effort by the government to provide information about how they're kind of handling the pandemic?
Well, I would say, of course, there's been efforts by the government. Of course, ICE is making some efforts to try to keep people safe, again, because it's not only about the people who are detained, it's about the people working with them who then go back and forth into the community. So certainly, I wouldn't want to say nobody's made any effort, but the efforts are uneven. And as I was saying, we only hear what we hear, so we don't really know how uneven the efforts are. But one thing I learned that, this may just be anecdotal, but people in some places are saying they don't have face masks. And I think that's ironic because the government has not been swift to provide inmates any place in any sort of detention with face masks. And the reason why people in prisons and jails tend to have face masks is not because of the government, but because of Jay-Z and Meek Mill, who started a program to provide people in detention with face masks. And evidently, not all of the facilities where immigrants are detained have come into contact with that program.
So then when you talk about the challenges that the ACLU has put forward, both with respect to prisons as well as detention centers during the pandemic, what does that challenge focus on? What's the goal that the ACLU is trying to pursue?
Well, I think there are a couple of different goals. And right now, the number one goal is to try to keep people safe. But longer term, I think the whole idea of secrecy, the idea that the government can run these facilities or send people to private prisons and not tell anyone what's going on, is part of what we have to chip away at. We have to get people to not accept that. And I think another thing that we're hoping will be a long-term benefit relates to the policies of mass incarceration, as well as our immigration policies, which result in so many people being in detention in the first place. And so one thing that we're hoping is that when communities realize that there was no problem in terms of public safety with having vulnerable people released from facilities, if elderly people are released into the community, it's not like crime is going to spike. And I think that if people get used to the idea that we don't need to be incarcerating so many people, I think then we can really start to attack the premises of our carceral state and the idea that what we need to deal with all of our problems is more police and more incarceration.
Well, you touched upon, of course, what has been front and center the last several weeks now in the United States. Of course, the rest of the world is also watching because when you talk about mass incarceration, it's inextricably tied to issues of racial justice and also policing, which came, of course, to the forefront of national attention with the May 25th killing of George Floyd, Black man in Minneapolis. And there's been protests for weeks in cities across the country, tens of thousands of people who've marched in the streets. What has been the ACLU's focus? Because you, of course, as an organization, have already done, as you were just alluding to, done a lot of work around these very issues with respect to policing and mass incarceration.
Right. Well, I think that you might say, first of all, that the whole, since the protests, we've had a third bucket of work. A lot of ACLU lawyers have had to respond to the grim irony that the way the police have been policing demonstrations about police brutality is to be brutal. In 98 cities, they've been using tear gas, which in addition to being harmful, increases the risk of people getting infected. People cough, their lungs are damaged. So we've had a number of ACLU affiliates that have brought lawsuits about policing of the protest itself in DC, in Minneapolis, where they brought a lawsuit on behalf of journalists who were being attacked for trying to cover the protests and trying to tell people what was actually going on, trying to show people. So there's been that, all the work about the protest and making sure that people know their rights while protesting. And then, so that's, one additional bucket. So the other thing is that, as you said, we were already doing the work of trying to reduce mass incarceration. And we have what we call a smart justice program, where we've been trying to get people to look at criminal justice system policies from stop and frisk to arrest to bail to sentencing that have racially disproportionate impacts and that are not really have very little to do with public safety. So in addition to everything else, we're now trying to build on the momentum of the protest to try to do what's possible. And I want to say, in talking about what's on our to-do list right now, I think there are like 3 different categories of what we're working on, which include the quote, defunding of the police that people talk about. There are immediate reforms that we think we can accomplish, which I'm happy to talk about your police accountability and conduct. Then there's decriminalization of just trying to have not so many people encounter the police. But on defunding, I think I want to start by saying that that's a word that is misunderstood a lot, and that makes people nervous.
I was going to actually ask you to kind of give people a better sense of what it really means, because it's become this rallying cry among a lot of the protesters and civil rights advocates. But, you know, of course, it's been politicized, and Republicans are turning it into, you know, this kind of way to draw contrast, saying, well, the left is, you know, pushing this radical proposal. But what does it really mean to defund the police?
Well, what it means, first of all, let me say, I think that the people who are afraid of defunding the police are the people who are fortunate enough to be in a position where the police make them feel safe. And I think one thing that the protests are teaching us is that not everyone feels safer when the police are around. Some people feel more threatened. And I think a lot of people are coming to terms with the costs of having so much policing and having policing and criminal justice be our answer to everything. So the basic idea of defunding is, instead of just reform the police by doing things like telling them don't use chokeholds and you know, don't break into Breonna Taylor's home in the middle of the night when she hasn't done anything wrong and then you end up shooting her, you know, things like that. But I think the idea is that those reforms are not enough. Yeah, and those reforms are, you know, being proposed all over the place right now. So let me tell you, in 2015, the ACLU did a report on the Minneapolis Police Department, which showed clearly that the Minneapolis Police Department was highly racist. They were arresting people almost over 8 times as often for minor offenses. And so the police department did adopt some reforms. They were doing bias training, and hey, it didn't work. It's not enough. And so I think what we mean by defunding is we mean examining policing from scratch and trying to reimagine where we actually want our response to be policing, and where we could be doing things that would actually make people safer. Like, instead of, you know, a quarter of the people who police end up arresting are people who have mental health issues and who are acting strangely. So if we had real mental health services to deal with those people, or if we dealt with homelessness or with drug addiction in ways other than having the police, you know, have a major footprint all over the place, if we didn't have police in the schools, if we dealt with our problems some other way, number one, we would be reducing the opportunities for the police to be effecting what I think almost inevitably is sometimes arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement. And number two, and I think this is really important, is we could use the money in better ways. The city of Los Angeles spends almost a third of its city budget on policing. They've just agreed to reduce that by some. But the idea of defunding is maybe we could use that money in better ways that would actually keep us safer if we had programs and crisis centers to help people who are mentally ill or homeless or who have drug problems.
Yeah, and you know, one of the other things that has come to people's attention is this question of bail funds. And you've seen, obviously, because of the number of protesters who've been arrested, efforts by those who support the protests to contribute to these bail funds. And I think a lot of people don't really understand, you know, what that issue is really about. And so I was hoping you could just talk about the ways in which there, of course, are people who are disproportionately affected by being arrested and then having to post bail, and how that ties into the protests.
Right. So bail funds are great. Again, it's a kind of a Band-Aid solution. People have to pay bail. Well, maybe we as a community could chip in and help them not be incarcerated when we don't think it's fair. And by the way, the policing of the protests has also been discriminatory. In Minneapolis, more people of color were arrested for protesting than white people. But our idea, we've just been attacking bail altogether. What do we need cash bail for? So here's another, I think, myth that people have in mind about the criminal justice system, that it's all about protecting us from violence. Well, according to FBI reports, out of how many arrests? Out of about 10, I figure that I wrote down for myself, but it was only 5% of all arrests that had anything to do with violence. 5%. All the rest of the arrests are for things like selling loose cigarettes on which the tax has not been paid, like Eric Garner, or being suspected of spending a $20 bill, like George Floyd. So that is the primary model that we're talking about. Should those people be locked up unless they can afford bail to bail themselves out? No. So to me, the problem isn't who pays the bail. we've been attacking the need for bail altogether. And one of the things that we've been doing is urging people to vote for district attorneys and prosecutors who will do what they can to change the policy of requiring cash bail. So I think what we're saying, the defunding idea, is just a word, and what it really means is strike the root of the problem instead of putting Band-Aids.
Absolutely. And, I think there's been obviously a lot of unrest over the past few weeks, and it's, if there's any good in it, there's a reckoning that's unlike any before. President Obama just a few weeks ago was talking about how, if you compare this to the civil rights movement in the 60s, one thing that is different is you have a much more cross-sectional group of people who are out there on the streets. There's so much more diversity, and especially among young people, I think there is a lot more of a desire to address these issues. But for a lot of people, between the pandemic and the protests, it's been a pretty depressing time. So there was a positive decision by the Supreme Court with respect to LGBT rights. Can you just quickly kind of break down what that meant?
Okay, on June 15th, the Supreme Court held in a case involving a man named Gerald Bostick, who was a child welfare worker in Georgia, who was fired when he joined a gay softball league. The ACLU had two clients, Amy Stevens, who was a funeral director in suburban Detroit, who was fired when she wrote her employer a really very touching letter explaining to him why she was going to be living her life as a woman, and Don Zarda, a skydiving instructor who was fired for being gay. So what the court held is that a statute, Title VII, which applies to employers with more than 15 employees, prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race. And what the Supreme Court held is that sex includes sexual identity and sexual orientation. So what Justice Neil Gorsuch said, who was not one of the most liberal members of the court, but he said, if you are fired, if Amy Stevens is fired because she wants to wear a dress, and a woman would not be, a born woman, a cis woman would not be fired for wearing a dress, that is sex discrimination. So I think what people need to know is that this is not a constitutional ruling, it's just the interpretation of a statute. But the same logic would apply to other statutes that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. I think the other thing I want to say in terms of the good news is that 70% of Americans think that this is fair, and Congress should have actually enacted an explicit law saying this years ago. There's an Equality Act that the House has passed, and one thing we're working to do is to get the Senate to pass it too, so that we can fill out the protections.
Well, I think, we'll end on a positive note, and we really appreciate talking to you. If you were to say in one sentence what, you think people should do moving forward if they want to help, what would it be?
I think my one sentence is voting. The election in November is highly threatened. We've been seeing what it's like to vote during a pandemic, and it is not easy. So we're working in more than 30 states to try to make access to the vote easier. What everybody should do is find out what your state needs to do to enable everyone to vote safely in the fall. Tell people how to register, check whether their names have been purged from the voting rolls, and vote like your rights depend on it.
Susan, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of you who tuned in. You're watching Collision from Home.